and welcome to Next Gen Finance, an SB podcast about sustainable finance. My name is Lina Apsheva, and in this episode, we will talk about nature-related risks and their impact on the economy, a topic that has, in the recent months, really come into the spotlight of sustainable finance. We have two parts to this episode. First, we'll talk with Sarah Draper, the Corporate Performance Program Manager at Global Canopy. I'm looking forward to asking Sarah about nature-related risks and why it's important to consider them when we're talking about finance. Later in the episode, we will also hear from my colleagues Anne Kästner and Mattsson, who some of you might remember from our episode on the Impact Metric tool, and who will update us on their work around integrating biodiversity considerations into the tool. But first and foremost, I'm excited to welcome Sarah Draper from Global Canopy to the podcast. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Lina. Thank you for having me.
So, Sarah, I'm really, like I said, excited to talk about nature-related risks. But before we get into that, I think some of our listeners might not be familiar with Global Canopy as an organization. So I was wondering if you could spend a minute or two telling us what you are as an organization and also what your role is as a corporate performance program manager.
So Global Canopy is a data-driven, not-for-profit organization, and we target the market forces destroying nature. So since 2001, we've been looking at new approaches to tackling deforestation in particular, and guiding companies, investors, and governments worldwide to think differently about our planet's forests. So we know change isn't easy, and we try to take a pragmatic approach to how we work with companies and financial institutions. We offer support in the form of data, metrics, and frameworks for action. And we try to have a two-way process to ensure that what we do is fit for purpose, market ready, and really useful for our audiences, and also evidence and data based. But at the same time, it's obviously really urgent that action is taken on nature and deforestation. We can't wait for this change to happen, so we do also hold laggards accountable. And we look at the performance of companies and financial institutions on tackling deforestation in supply chains and portfolios. We make that data available in public rankings and in tools for others to use to understand company links to deforestation. So in my role as Corporate Performance Program Manager, I oversee a few projects that work on those topics. So in our Forest 500 project, we identify the 500 companies and financial institutions that are the most influential in supply chains linked to deforestation. And we annually assess them on their commitments and action to tackle deforestation and related human rights abuses. Then Aligned Accountability is a project where we're bringing together data that financial institutions can use to understand company exposure and action. So bringing different data sets together to enable deforestation and related human rights abuses to be taken into account in mainstream financial decisions. And then finally, we're also looking at creating guidance for financial institutions on how to address deforestation and related human rights abuse risks in their portfolios through our deforestation-free finance work.
You mentioned the word deforestation a couple times. Another quite a big buzzword right now in the world of sustainable finance is biodiversity, which I know is quite closely linked to deforestation. And what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, nature. So what I was wondering is, what exactly do we mean when we say nature-related risks? And how does nature in this context relate to things such as biodiversity or deforestation, for example?
So nature is obviously a really, really broad term, and biodiversity is a little bit more specific. So it's talking about the variety of life on Earth and all the different species that we have. But they can often be used interchangeably. And really, nature or biodiversity loss, however you want to frame it, are both critical issues that face the world today alongside the climate crisis, which is obviously really interrelated. The way we live depends on the natural world and the species and the ecosystems that exist today, and impacts from business, from many sectors that cause biodiversity loss are then risking those systems that we depend on with far-reaching consequences. And the pandemic has been a really big example to show us how much we depend on them And it's been shown that there's an increased risk of zoonotic diseases causing pandemics because of the destruction of nature that we're seeing. So, yeah, I mentioned deforestation, and that's a really critical issue for nature and biodiversity loss, because the world's forests hold around 2/3 of the world's biodiversity. But it's also a critical part of the climate crisis. So deforestation produces around 15% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. And on the flip side, protecting forests and the biodiversity within them could provide up to 1/3 of the climate solution that we need. So deforestation can be quite a useful issue to focus on at the kind of the nexus between those two crises, the climate and the nature crisis that we face.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned, the relationship between things like nature loss or deforestation and climate change. And especially for myself as a sustainable finance analyst, I can say that since I started in this industry, I've seen a lot of focus in companies and, also when it comes to financial tools related to sustainability, there's a lot of focus on climate change and emissions. And I think it's really cool to see how that is expanding to include things like biodiversity, for example. And I'm glad that you mentioned how nature loss or nature risks can impact our day-to-day life. But I want to kind of tilt this conversation a little bit towards the economy and finance and ask you, what are the nature-related risks that exist for the economy?
So there's lots of different types of risks that businesses and the economy face from nature loss. So the first and perhaps the most obvious perhaps is physical risks. So some businesses directly are involved in in nature, so in production of crops, for instance, and biodiversity loss, nature loss can directly impact the way that those businesses are run. So a good example is the loss of pollinators, the loss of pollinating species that really threaten many of our food crops. So then the producers of those crops are at risk, and their businesses are at risk, and then businesses down the supply chain are at risk there as well. Another risk is reputational. So consumers are becoming more and more aware of the indirect impacts that businesses can have on the planet. And they don't really want to be buying products or services that contribute to nature destruction or climate change. So that's becoming an increasing risk as well for businesses to be able to prove that they're not linked to these destructive practices. And then a third type of risk is kind of transition or regulatory risks. So as the awareness of our dependency on nature and the risks associated with nature loss grow, more businesses or governments are taking action to address these risks, either in their sourcing, in their financing, and also in their legislative decisions in the case of governments. So an organization that is not aware or acting on these risks already faces being left behind if requirements are put in place by their customers, by their financiers, or by the governments where they're operating.
Yeah, definitely. And hearing you talk about this, I think it's difficult to understate what a huge role nature really plays in our economy as a whole. And I think a lot of people will be wondering, listening to this, why is it relevant, or in what way can we bring nature and biodiversity into the conversation around finance specifically?
With the risks that I just talked about, the kind of physical, reputational, transition risks for businesses, those then can have financial implications for those businesses. So they can result in lower profits, they can make it more likely that they might default on loans, they can affect the value of a company. So in that way, it can then have impact on the financial institutions that are providing finance to those businesses. So they might be losing or a lower return on investment, for instance, or their loans might be less likely to be repaid. But also there's some direct risks to financial institutions, right? So the reputational risk that I talked about can impact financial institutions just as much as it can companies. There was a recent survey by Make My Money Matter who spoke to savers about their pensions, and they found the vast majority of the savers were really clear that they didn't want the money in their pensions to be financing organizations that are linked to deforestation. So there's also that reputational risk coming directly to financial institutions as well.
Pensions is a big part of how private individuals can affect the flow of the money and, what type of activities are being financed. But from my side, I can also add that I think there is a lot of potential for sustainable finance products to also create positive impact or maybe decrease the negative impact on nature through the financial activities. We've seen this work with emissions, and hopefully we'll see more action now when it comes to deforestation, nature loss, biodiversity, and other related topics as well. That being said, Sarah, I know that Global Canopy is one of the founding members of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which I think will also play quite a big role in the way the market is going to be shaped in relation to nature. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the task force, TNFD, and what it's going to do in this market.
Yeah, so the TNFD is, as you said, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And that's an alliance of many organizations working together to develop a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related risks. So it's building on from the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And the aim really is to support a shift in global financial flows, as you've kind of said, away from nature negative and towards nature positive outcomes, by providing that framework for disclosures, for the data that financial institutions need in order to make those decisions.
And if I remember correctly, we're expecting the TNFD framework to be released in the beginning of next year, 2023. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. But there will be a beta version launched this year to allow for testing and iteration before the final framework is released next year.
But Sarah, looking into the future, again, I'm wondering, what are your expectations when it comes to the nature-related risks and how the market might change when we start to integrate this thinking around nature, deforestation, biodiversity into the way we work?
As you've said, and we've definitely seen over the last year or so, there's so much more attention coming from the finance sector on nature, biodiversity, and deforestation. And there's also a lot more pressure on them to act and rising expectations for finance to take a lead and to drive companies to be acting. And there's also pressure on them to deliver on some of the commitments that they've already made, right? So many financial institutions signed commitments to tackle, for instance, deforestation in their portfolios. So over the next few years and looking to the future, I'm looking forward to seeing how they then act on those commitments and really start to drive change. There is already data for them to be able to start assessing and acting on nature-related risks, and that's only going to improve over the next few years. There's lots of projects to make it easier for financial institutions to understand those risks. So I'm looking forward to seeing the integration of nature-related risks into financial decisions becoming much more mainstream, and then eventually becoming mandatory, as we really see that not taking these risks into account will result in lower returns. It's irresponsible not to, and it's part of their fiduciary duty as well to be making sure that they're thinking about the future and taking these risks into account in their decisions.
Looking forward to see new products coming out and new attention focusing on this extremely important subject. I think a lot of people listening to this episode might be thinking, that it is a very important subject and kind of coming to a realization of how much attention there will be placed on it in the future, but maybe they don't know how exactly to integrate this type of thinking into their work, whether it's in finance or in other areas of business. So I'm wondering, do you have any advice to people like that on where they might be able to start?
So I think my first piece of advice would be that there is a lot of guidance out there. So really don't feel like you have to start from scratch or work it all out yourself. But the first step really is to try and understand your exposure to different nature-related risks. And again, there's lots of tools and guidance out there to help with this. But that can then allow you to prioritize those risks where you have the greatest exposure, where you have the greatest influence, and where the impact on nature is the greatest. So you can, focus your efforts on those where you can have the greatest impact on the planet. And then look for guidance to see how you can address those risks that you've prioritized. And then finally, I'd just say, please communicate about what you're doing and talk about it publicly. You tell your stakeholders what you're doing. It's really important to be sharing these stories, to be learning from each other, to be driving change. And you may find that there are peers or stakeholders or colleagues that are interested in collaborating and working with you as well.
Definitely. Transparency is a pillar, I would say, of sustainability as a whole and sustainable finance specifically. And it needs to translate from, the conversations around emissions into nature as well. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insights, and I hope that maybe in the future we can talk again and see where the market, I guess, has gone from since we've talked today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Lina. It was lovely to talk to you.
Hi, Anne. Hi, Jessica. Welcome back to the podcast. It's been a little while since we last talked in this format, and for our listeners who maybe haven't had a chance yet to listen to the episode where you talked to me about IMT, the impact metric tool, could you, Anne, maybe quickly recap a little bit what IMT is all about?
Thanks for having us again, Lina. It's always a pleasure to be here. And yes, the impact metric tool, or IMT as we short call it, is a tool to analyze investment portfolios from different, sustainability perspectives. So we can analyze portfolios consisting of listed companies when it comes to, carbon intensity or the impact on certain SDGs and so on.
For anyone who wants to know more, you're welcome to go back and listen to the episode where Anna and Jessica gave us quite a lot of details about how the tool works. Yes. It's actually one of my favorite episodes. So yeah, definitely go in and listen. But now let's talk a little bit about the biodiversity module. You mentioned in the previous episode that you would start thinking into integrating biodiversity into the tool. And I think since we're talking about nature on this episode today, it would be great if you could tell us about how the update has been going. Jessica, maybe you would like to let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. So since we were here the last time, we've actually developed the first model draft of a biodiversity model, and we started testing it as well already. So this model enables us to analyze portfolios of listed companies and what their biodiversity impact is. And actually, we don't really analyze the biodiversity, but instead we look at the nature-related risks of the companies and the portfolio. So that's what we measure.
So why do you think that it's important to, or why did you decide in the first place to integrate biodiversity into the tool? And maybe you want to tell us a little bit more about how exactly, what the process looks like for measuring these impacts?
I guess for impacts, we can also go back to your first guest on the podcast today. I'm pretty sure that the listeners will already have a little bit of an idea on why it is important. But for us, we wanted to do this now because there are not too many ways out there on how to measure portfolios from a nature risk perspective. And we felt that it was important to have something in order to, build understanding and build knowledge with our clients and have these discussions already now before, for example, the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Risks, will come out with their recommendations so that, we're already a little bit front running. We're starting a little bit so that we have the knowledge that we need then later on to be able to assess nature-related risks better.
And maybe moving on to how we do that is that we look at companies and we get revenue data. So we know what the companies are doing, what activities they are doing. But of course, all of these different activities have different impacts and dependency on natural capital. So just as an example, if we take a company that's in construction business, so they have revenues coming from the manufacturing of cement, we would then look at what kind of impacts and dependency that industry has. For example, the construction materials in general have a very high impact on water, but also a dependency on water, and of course other natural assets as well.
Yeah, you can't really manufacture cement without using water, right? So if there wouldn't be enough water, then you wouldn't be able to do your economic activity and get profits anymore.
That is exactly what we try to map out in the model. So we try to connect the very specific company revenue data to the maybe a little bit broader, the impact and the dependency on natural capital.
I mean, just hearing you talk about it and also hearing Sarah earlier, it is such a complicated issue when you think about it. There are so many things that go into working with this topic. So I was wondering, have you faced any challenges in this work?
Yeah, so one major challenge that we faced is that it's very difficult to take into consideration the location of the company. So of course, when we talk about natural capital and biodiversity, it differs a lot depending on where in the world that you are.
Another big challenge that we face is the translation of these impacts and dependencies into financial risks. You know, how can we put a value in US dollars or in Swedish crowns on an impact that a company has on a certain natural asset or a natural capital asset? And right now, we don't feel that we have the experience and also that there is enough research out there to do this. But we still think it's important to show both the impacts and the dependencies, because that means that people slowly but surely get used to the idea that there is a financial impact. And, you know, the more we get an understanding of the different risks, the easier it will become then later on to translate them into a financial value.
And speaking about the future, I'm wondering, what are your expectations about where this conversation might go in the future?
I think that we will see a lot of different, movements in that field. You're one of the people in our team who's always, on the forefront speaking about the biodiversity, and I really feel like it has become a topic on everybody's minds. And as soon as something like that happens, as soon as you have a task force like the TNFD, you will get more data made available, both by companies but also by different kinds of data providers, which I find very exciting, because that means that we will be able to measure things better. And then as soon as we start measuring, companies want to compare to each other, so they will start producing more data and so on. I think it's like a positive feedback cycle, or at least that's my hope.
I guess we shall stay hopeful. Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Jessica, for coming back to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you as always. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in for these conversations, which I thought were very insightful, and I hope you all agree with me. As always, you can send us your feedback or suggestions for topics for future episodes to nextgenfin@seb.se. I also invite you to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast app to make sure that you stay updated when new episodes come out in the future. Until then, take care, stay safe, and goodbye.